Sister Margaret O'Brien had kept the secret for 63 years. In the spring of 2000, at 91 years old and days from death in a Los Angeles hospice, she finally decided the truth mattered more than the promise she'd made. She called for a priest, not for last rites, but to witness what she was about to reveal. Her voice was barely a whisper as she spoke into a tape recorder, her arthritic hands clutching a yellowed envelope that had been hidden in her Bible since 1937. "I was there the night Jean Harlow died," she began, her breathing labored. "I was the night nurse on duty at Good Samaritan Hospital, June 7, 1937. What I saw that night, what they made me promise never to tell, it wasn't what the newspapers reported. Jean didn't die from kidney failure alone. She died from something they gave her, something that made sure she'd never wake up to tell what she knew." Inside the envelope were 3 items: a hospital medication log with entries that had been altered, a handwritten note in Jean's distinctive script, and a photograph that showed 2 men in suits standing outside Jean's hospital room at 3 a.m. Men who weren't family, weren't doctors, and according to Sister Margaret, shouldn't have been there at all. To understand what Sister Margaret witnessed that night, we need to go back 6 weeks to late April 1937, when Jean Harlow was still filming Saratoga, and still clinging to the belief that she might survive whatever was destroying her body. Jen had been sick for months, maybe longer. The official story blamed childhood scarlet fever that had damaged her kidneys, a ticking time bomb that finally detonated in her 20s. But people who worked closely with her told different stories. Stories about the vitamin shots studio doctors administered daily, about the pills that kept her working 18-hour days, about the visible deterioration that makeup could barely conceal. By late April, Jean could no longer hide how sick she was. Her face was bloated with fluid retention, her hands trembled constantly, and she'd started forgetting lines, not just stumbling over words, but complete memory blanks where entire scenes would simply vanish from her mind. On April 28, Jean had what crew members described as a breakdown on set. She'd been trying to film a dance sequence with Clark Gable when she suddenly stopped mid-scene, looked around in confusion, and said, "I don't know where I am. I don't know what I'm supposed to be doing." She wasn't acting. For a moment, Jean Harlow, the woman who'd spent 7 years performing every second of her life, had genuinely forgotten she was on a movie set. The director called for a break. Jean was taken to her dressing room, where the studio doctor examined her briefly before administering one of those mysterious injections. 20 minutes later, Jean returned to set, smiled brightly, and completed the scene perfectly. Whatever was in that syringe had flipped a switch, transforming her from confused and disoriented to professionally functional. But several crew members noticed something else: the look in Jean's eyes after that injection. One electrician later described it as terrified compliance, like she knew what they were doing to her, but had decided survival meant cooperating. The handwritten note that Sister Margaret preserved for 63 years was dated May 15, 1937. It was written on hotel stationery from the Beverly, Wilshire, where Jean had been staying since her mother insisted she needed spiritual healing, away from Hollywood's corrupting influences. The note was addressed to William Powell, Jean's fiancé, but it was never sent. Sister Margaret claimed Jean had given it to her during one of several secret hospital visits Jean made in the weeks before her final admission, visits that don't appear in any official records. The note reads, in part, "Dearest William, I need you to know that if something happens to me, if I don't make it through whatever this is, it wasn't an accident, and it wasn't God's will. They've been poisoning me slowly, methodically, for reasons I'm only beginning to understand. I know things I shouldn't know. I saw something I wasn't supposed to see. And now they need me to either forget or disappear. I'm writing this down because I don't trust my own memory anymore. The medications they give me, they make everything fuzzy, like I'm watching my life through fog, but I'm lucid right now, and I need to record this while I can. Paul didn't kill himself. I know what happened that night, and they know I know. That's why I'm dying." Paul burned Jean's second husband, the MGM executive, found dead in 1932 with a gunshot wound and a cryptic suicide note. The official ruling was suicide, though whispers of murder had circulated for years, but Jean had never publicly contradicted the suicide narrative. Until this note, there was no evidence she doubted it herself. Now here was Jean, 5 years after Paul's death, claiming not only that it was murder, but that her own declining health was connected to her knowledge of what really happened. Here's where documented history collides with speculation that several researchers have found disturbingly plausible. According to an alternative theory built on Sister Margaret's testimony and other fragmentary evidence, Jean Harlow discovered something about Paul Byrne's death that made her a liability to powerful people at MGM. The theory goes like this. Paul Byrne's death wasn't suicide and wasn't a random murder. It was an execution designed to look like suicide, carried out because Paul had discovered financial irregularities at MGM, embezzlement, fraud, potentially criminal misuse of studio funds involving executives at the highest levels. Jean knew this because Paul had confided in her shortly before his death. He'd shown her documents, explained what he'd found, told her he was planning to go to the authorities. Then he died, the documents disappeared, and Jean was told by people who made it very clear what would happen if she didn't cooperate, that the suicide story was the only acceptable narrative. For 5 years, Jean stayed silent. She played the grieving widow, accepted the official story, and tried to move on with her life. But according to this theory, something changed in early 1937. Maybe she'd decided she couldn't carry the secret anymore. Maybe she'd confided in someone she thought she could trust. Maybe she'd threatened to go public. Whatever the trigger, MGM decided Jean had become too dangerous to ignore. But they couldn't just kill her. Not overtly, not obviously. Jean Harlow dying in a suspicious accident or a violent crime would generate investigations, questions, publicity. They needed her death to look natural, inevitable, tragic, but explainable, so they killed her slowly. They gave her compounds that accelerated her kidney failure. They prevented her from getting proper medical treatment during the crucial weeks when intervention might have saved her life. And when she finally collapsed and was admitted to the hospital in critical condition, they made sure she'd never leave. The medication log that Sister Margaret preserved is one of the most damning pieces of evidence, if it's authentic. The document shows Jean's final 30 hours at Good Samaritan Hospital, with entries recording every medication administered, every vital sign checked, every procedure performed. Several entries are crossed out and rewritten. In nursing, this is highly irregular. Errors in medication logs are supposed to be noted, not erased. But someone had taken a pen and heavily redacted certain entries, then written new ones in different handwriting. Sister Margaret claimed she'd made a copy of the original log before it was altered. According to her account, the original showed that Jean received an injection at 2:47 a.m. on June 7, about 8 hours before her death at 11:37 a.m. The medication was listed as morphine, a standard pain management drug, but the dosage was marked as 100 milligrams, which medical experts have noted is an extremely high dose, potentially lethal for someone in Jean's compromised condition. In the altered version of the log, that entry is crossed out. The replacement entry shows the same time, but lists the medication as 10 milligrams of morphine, a standard therapeutic dose. Someone changed the records to hide the fact that Jean had been given a potentially fatal overdose of pain medication. The question is, was it a medical error that was covered up, or was it intentional? Sister Margaret's most explosive claim concerns the 2 men she saw outside Jean's hospital room in the early morning hours of June 7. According to her account, she was making her rounds around 3 a.m. when she noticed 2 well-dressed men standing near Jean's door, speaking in low voices. This was unusual. Visiting hours were long over, and even family members were typically restricted after 10 p.m. When Sister Margaret approached to ask who they were, one of them flashed a badge. She couldn't see it clearly, but he claimed they were hospital security, conducting a routine check. She found this suspicious because she knew all the hospital security guards, and these men weren't familiar. She continued her rounds, but something about the encounter bothered her. About 20 minutes later, she decided to check on Jean. As she approached the room, she saw one of the men exiting. He was carrying a small black medical bag, the kind doctors used for house calls. Sister Margaret entered John's room and found her patient deeply unconscious, barely responsive. Her breathing was shallow and irregular. The IV line had been adjusted, not by Sister Margaret or any of the nursing staff she'd spoken with. When she checked the medication log, there was no entry for any treatment administered during that time. She immediately called for the attending physician. By the time he arrived, the 2 men had disappeared. The doctor examined Jean, noted her deteriorating condition, but seemed oddly unconcerned about the unauthorized visitors or the adjusted IV line. He told Sister Margaret to note in the log that Jean had received morphine for pain, but again, the dosage he dictated didn't match what Sister Margaret suspected had actually been administered. The photograph Sister Margaret kept for 63 years is grainy and slightly out of focus, but it clearly shows 2 men in dark suits standing in a hospital corridor. Sister Margaret claimed she took it with a small camera she'd brought to document her granddaughter's birth the previous week. When she saw the men loitering near Jean's room again, this time around 4 a.m., after Jean's condition had dramatically worsened, she decided to photograph them. Her reasoning was simple. If something was wrong, if Jean's death turned out to be suspicious, there would be evidence that unauthorized individuals had access to her room during her final hours. The men's faces are partially visible. For decades, the photograph was just an unidentified image. But in 2018, a film historian who was researching MGM's security operations in the 1930s compared the photograph to personnel files from the studio's archives. One of the men, he concluded with reasonable certainty, was Lawrence Larry Weintraub, who served as Louis B. Mayer's personal security chief and occasional problem solver. Weintraub's presence at Good Samaritan Hospital at 4 a.m. on the morning of Jean Harlow's death raises obvious questions. What was MGM's head of security doing there? Who authorized his access? And what was in that medical bag he was seen carrying? Sister Margaret's account of what happened after Jean's death is consistent with a coordinated cover-up. Within hours of Jean's passing at 11:37 a.m., multiple MGM representatives arrived at the hospital. They met with administrators, doctors, and select nursing staff in closed-door sessions. Sister Margaret was pulled into one of these meetings. She was told that Jean Harlow's death was a tragedy that would generate enormous publicity, that the hospital needed to protect patient privacy and medical integrity, and that any speculation about unusual circumstances would be harmful to Jean's family and to Good Samaritan's reputation. She was specifically instructed not to discuss the visitors she'd seen, not to mention any irregularities in treatment, and not to talk to the press under any circumstances. When she raised concerns about the altered medication log, she was told the corrections were routine administrative updates to ensure accuracy. She was also told, and this part was delivered with what she described as veiled menace, that her nursing license and her ability to find future employment depended on her discretion. The message was clear: stay silent or face consequences. Sister Margaret, a young nurse from a poor Irish Catholic family, couldn't afford to lose her job, so she signed the confidentiality agreement they put in front of her, accepted the explanation she knew was false, and kept quiet. But she also kept copies: the photograph, the original medication log entry she'd transcribed, and Jean's unsent letter to William Powell, which she'd found tucked in Jean's hospital gown and hidden before anyone else could discover it. William Powell arrived at the hospital around 9 a.m. on June 7, 2.5 hours before Jean died. According to multiple witnesses, he was devastated, the elegant, controlled actor completely undone by grief. He sat beside Jean's bed, holding her hand, speaking to her even though she was unconscious. Sister Margaret claimed she heard him say something that struck her as odd at the time. "I'm sorry I couldn't protect you. I'm sorry I didn't believe you when you told me." What hadn't he believed? What had Jean told him that he'd dismissed? Powell never remarried after Jean's death, though he lived another 47 years. He gave hundreds of interviews over his long career, but he almost never discussed Jean, and when he did, his comments were brief and carefully controlled. He maintained that her death was a medical tragedy, nothing more. But several people close to Powell reported that he carried guilt about Jean for the rest of his life. One friend, speaking after Powell's death in 1984, claimed Powell had once confided, "She tried to tell me something was wrong, that she was in danger. I thought she was being paranoid, overdramatic. I thought the medications were making her confused. I was wrong, and by the time I realized how wrong I was, it was too late." If Jean had indeed told Powell about her suspicions regarding Paul Byrne's death, about her fear that MGM was poisoning her, Powell would have faced an impossible choice after her death: stay silent and protect himself, or speak out and potentially be destroyed by the same forces that killed Jean. He chose silence, and he lived with that choice for 47 years. For 63 years, Sister Margaret O'Brien honored the agreement she'd signed, the promise she'd made, the silence she'd maintained. She married, raised 4 children, continued nursing until her retirement in 1978, and never spoke publicly about what she'd witnessed in Jean Harlow's hospital room. But in 1999, when she was diagnosed with terminal cancer, something shifted. Her children were grown, her husband was deceased, and she'd been watching the world change around her. She'd seen the gradual erosion of MGM's power, the death of everyone who'd intimidated her into silence, and the emergence of a culture that was more willing to question official narratives. She began writing down her memories, recording details she'd carried silently for 6 decades. And in the spring of 2000, as her health rapidly declined, she decided the truth mattered more than fear. She called a priest she trusted, a young man who'd been assigned to her parish and who'd studied film history in seminary. She gave him the envelope containing the photograph, the transcribed medication log, and Jean's letter. She recorded her testimony on tape, speaking slowly and clearly, determined to get every detail right. "I don't know if this will change anything," she said near the end of the recording. "All the people who could be held accountable are long dead, but Jean Harlow deserves to have someone acknowledge what was done to her. She was murdered, not with a gun or a knife, but with medications and medical access, and the calculated decision to let her die rather than risk what she might say if she lived." Sister Margaret died 3 days after making that recording. The priest she'd confided in delivered the materials to a film archive, with instructions that they be preserved but not made public until he determined the time was right. He's still alive, now in his early 50s, and he's never released the full contents of Sister Margaret's confession. This brings us to the central problem with Sister Margaret's story. We can't fully verify it. The photograph exists, it's in the archive, and experts agree it appears to show Larry Weintraub. The transcribed medication log exists, though it's impossible to prove it's an accurate copy of the original. Jean's letter exists, and handwriting analysis suggests it's consistent with Jean's writing, though absolute confirmation is impossible. But we don't have the actual altered hospital log to compare against Sister Margaret's transcription. We don't have testimony from any other witnesses who saw the men in suits. We don't have medical records that definitively prove Jean was given a lethal overdose rather than dying from kidney failure. What we have is the testimony of a woman who waited until she was dying to reveal what she'd seen, who had no apparent motive to fabricate such a story, but whose claims are impossible to fully substantiate or disprove. This is the maddening reality of historical mysteries. The truth might be there, preserved in fragments, but the complete picture has been destroyed or hidden so effectively that we can never quite assemble it with certainty. If Sister Margaret's account is true, if Jean Harlow was murdered to protect MGM's secrets, then we're forced to confront some disturbing questions about how Hollywood's golden age actually functioned. How many other deaths were arranged or accelerated to protect studio interests? How many performers died from natural causes that were actually the result of systematic poisoning through studio medications? How many secrets were buried along with the people who knew them? And if Sister Margaret's account isn't true, if it's a false memory or a fabricated story from a dying woman seeking attention, what does that say about our relationship with Hollywood mythology? Are we so eager to believe in conspiracies and cover-ups that we'll accept dramatic stories without sufficient evidence? The truth is probably somewhere in between. MGM definitely engaged in unethical and potentially criminal behavior in how they treated contract players. Jean Harlow definitely died young from kidney failure that might have been treatable with proper medical care. The studio definitely benefited from her death by being able to complete Saratoga and generate sympathy publicity. Whether those facts add up to premeditated murder or merely negligent indifference is a question we may never be able to answer definitively. But here's what haunts me about Sister Margaret's confession. She had nothing to gain by making it. She was dying, beyond the reach of legal or professional consequences. She wasn't seeking money or fame. She asked that her identity be protected and the materials not be released during her children's lifetimes. She just wanted someone to know. She wanted Jean Harlow's voice, that unsent letter, those desperate claims of being poisoned, to be preserved. Maybe that's enough. Maybe bearing witness, even decades too late, still matters. Jean Harlow died at 26. The official cause was cerebral edema secondary to uremic poisoning from kidney failure. That's what the death certificate says. That's what the newspapers reported. That's what Hollywood history has recorded. But if a nurse who was there that night is telling the truth, Jean Harlow was murdered, killed to protect secrets that died with her, buried beneath layers of falsified records and intimidated witnesses, and the calculated silence of everyone who knew what really happened. We'll never know for certain. The evidence is fragmentary, the witnesses are dead, and the institutions that might have been complicit have evolved or dissolved beyond accountability. But Sister Margaret's confession forces us to ask, how many stories like this are there? How many deaths that we've accepted as tragic accidents or natural causes were actually something darker? How many secrets are still buried, still protected, still considered too dangerous to reveal even a century later? Jean Harlow, wanted William Powell to know that if something happened to her, it wouldn't be an accident. Sister Margaret spent 63 years carrying that message, that testimony, that burden, and now we carry it. The question is, what do we do with it?